Let me describe a company to you, and tell me if you think it's going to survive. The company was founded in 1889 with a royal charter from Queen Victoria. Its charter gave it the right to negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, establish courts, maintain a police force, levy taxes, and govern territories on behalf of the British Crown. Its founder, Cecil Rhodes, had already made a fortune in diamonds and sat as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, making him simultaneously a head of government and a corporate executive in the territories adjacent to the ones his company was about to conquer. The company raised its initial capital on the London Stock Exchange, approximately £1 million, later expanded significantly, on the promise that the territories it was about to acquire contained gold deposits comparable to or exceeding the Witwatersrand, then the largest known gold reserve on Earth. The company used its private army, approximately 700 mounted police equipped with rifles and Maxim machine guns, the first operational deployment of the Maxim gun in history, to invade and conquer the Ndebele Kingdom of Matabeleland in 1893, annexing it to its existing territorial holdings. It then administered the combined territories of what it called Rhodesia, an area larger than France and Germany combined, collecting taxes from African residents to fund operations that its charter had assumed would be funded by mineral royalties. Those mineral royalties were substantially smaller than promised, because the gold deposits were substantially smaller than promised. The company survived a parliamentary investigation following a private military operation, organized by its most senior on-the-ground administrator, using its own police force, into a sovereign foreign country, which failed entirely, and which its London directors claimed, under oath, they knew nothing about. Evidence later emerged that the company's own directors had sold the majority of their personal stock holdings before the raid, reducing their collective position from over 900,000 shares to fewer than 62,000 shares between July 1895 and March 1896. The company survived 2 wars in its own territories when the Ndebele and Shona populations rose in simultaneous rebellion in 1896 and 1897. It survived only because the British government sent troops, at the company's expense, to suppress the uprisings. The company's charter was renewed once, for 10 years, in 1914. When it expired in 1924, the company handed governance of Northern Rhodesia to the Crown, and accepted self-governance for Southern Rhodesia's white settler population. It retained its mineral rights. In 35 years of existence, the company paid no dividend to ordinary shareholders. 35 years, 0 return. And here is the contrarian question that this timeline forces. If the financial model was broken from essentially the beginning, what was the company actually for? If it never delivered on its commercial promise, the one that investors were told about, the one that justified the charter, the one that Rhodes propagandized across London and the press, what was actually happening inside this corporate structure for 3.5 decades? The answer is a very expensive, very violent, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to extract wealth from a continent that did not contain the wealth its promoters had promised. This is the corporate death timeline of the British South Africa Company, and it is, in retrospect, one of the most instructive in history. The British South Africa Company was not a normal company. Understanding what it was, structurally, is essential to understanding how it failed. It was modeled explicitly on the British East India Company, not coincidentally. The EIC had been the template for corporate sovereignty for 2 centuries, a private company with royal authorization to govern territories, maintain armies, levy taxes, and exercise sovereign powers in regions where the British government wanted the benefits of empire without the direct cost. The BSAC was designed on exactly this model. Private capital taking the risk, British government providing the legal framework and the ultimate military backup. The charter granted on October 29, 1889, gave the BSAC sweeping powers in an area vaguely defined as Central Africa, north of the existing British territories. It could make treaties, it could issue regulations, it could maintain order. It was explicitly permitted to establish a police force. It was expected to fund all of this from its commercial revenues, primarily the mineral royalties it would collect from the mining operations that Rhodes had assured investors and the Colonial Office were imminent. The board of directors assembled by Rhodes was not chosen for its business acumen. The Duke of Abercorn was appointed chairman. The Earl of Fife served as his deputy. Neither had significant business experience. Neither took their responsibilities particularly seriously. They were chosen for their social connections, their royal proximity, and, as events would reveal, their willingness to provide the company with the respectable aristocratic veneer it needed to attract the kind of investor who trusted a duke more than a prospectus. The actual operating capacity of the company resided in Rhodes himself and in Leander Starr Jameson, a former physician turned colonial administrator who served as the company's chief executive on the ground in Rhodesia. Rhodes ran strategy and finance from a distance, pulling in resources from De Beers and Goldfields when the BSAC's own accounts ran short. Jameson ran operations, which in practice meant military operations, land confiscation, tax collection, in the governance of territory that the company was acquiring faster than it could develop. The fundamental promise to investors was straightforward. The territories north of the Limpopo River, specifically the region the company named Mashonaland in what is now Zimbabwe, contained gold. Not ordinary gold, gold comparable to the Witwatersrand, a second rand. The company would mine it, the royalties would fund the administration, and investors would receive returns. This promise was repeated with extraordinary confidence. Explorers' accounts were selectively highlighted. Geological assessments that were less optimistic were suppressed or qualified. The press, much of which depended on advertising from companies that Rhodes or his associates had financial stakes in, carried favorable coverage. When Henry Labouchere, the editor of the journal Truth, raised serious questions about the BSAC's prospects as early as 1889 and 1890, calling it a speculative venture whose prospects depended entirely on finding commercial gold, and predicting that when the gold didn't appear, the company would invade neighboring territories to look for more, he was widely dismissed. He was right about almost everything. By 1891, the BSAC's cash position had already required supplementary funding from De Beers and personal contributions from Rhodes and Alfred Bate, his business partner. By 1893, the company's administrative account was running consistent deficits. The cost of maintaining a police force, approximately £150,000 per year, an enormous sum, was described internally as the company's most ruinous single expense. The BSAC was, within 3 years of its founding, already operating in deficit, already dependent on Rhodes's diamond profits to stay solvent, and already planning its next territorial acquisition, to find the gold that Mashonaland had failed to deliver. These are the conditions under which the company's 5 fatal decisions were made. Decision number 1, the Rudd Concession, a contract built on misrepresentation. The first decision, the foundational one, was the acquisition of the Rudd Concession in 1888, which became the legal basis for the entire BSAC enterprise. And it was built on misrepresentation from the first word. Lobengula was the king of the Ndebele people, a powerful, sophisticated ruler who had watched the European advance into southern Africa with careful attention. He was not naive. He had seen what happened to kingdoms that gave Europeans unrestricted access, and he was determined to protect his people's sovereignty while managing the pressure of British interest in his territory. In October 1888, representatives of Cecil Rhodes, led by Charles Rudd, negotiated a concession with Lobengula for mineral rights in his territory. The concession, as Lobengula understood it, was limited. A small number of prospectors, operating within defined constraints, seeking minerals with a commitment not to interfere with governance or sovereignty. He would receive a monthly payment, 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and a rifle. In exchange, he granted mineral prospecting rights. The concession as written, in English, which Lobengula could not fully read, conveyed something dramatically different. It granted complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals in his territory, and the right to do all things necessary to exploit those rights. It gave the concession holders the power to take any action necessary to protect and develop the concession. In the hands of Rhodes' legal team and the Colonial Office, it became the foundation for the BSAC's Royal Charter and a justification for territorial governance. Lobengula repudiated the concession almost immediately. He sent envoys to Queen Victoria. He wrote letters of protest. He told visitors, in words that have been recorded and repeated, "Did you ever see a chameleon get the color of a stone? and then change to the color of the grass? That is what the white men do. The repudiation was ignored. The charter was issued anyway. The Wikipedia entry on the BSAC states plainly, when the BSAC was unable to get Lobengula to sign the treaties on the agreed terms, they lied. When Lobengula's letter arrived in London in June 1889, rejecting the Rudd concession, it did not slow the momentum gathering for the charter. The concession was transferred to the Central Search Association, then to the BSAC. The charter was granted on October 29, 1889. The assumption it contained, that the BSAC had obtained Lobengula's agreement to govern Mashonaland, was false. Lobengula never gave that agreement. The legal foundation of the entire corporate enterprise was a document that its principal signatory had repudiated, and that had been secured through misrepresentation. This was not incidental to the company's problems. It was structural. It operated in a legal gray zone that required military force to maintain. For as long as Lobengula lived, until his death in 1894, under disputed circumstances, after fleeing the destruction of Bulawayo, the BSAC could not establish a legally unambiguous basis for territorial governance. The first decision made the company legally vulnerable from day one, and every subsequent escalation, the pioneer column marching into Mashonaland in 1890, the War of 1893, the 1896 uprisings, was partly a consequence of building an empire on a foundation that its own central document could not actually support. Decision number 2, the First Matabele War. Manufacturing a pretext. The second decision, the one that should have triggered the most immediate corporate accountability, was the decision to go to war against the Ndebele Kingdom in 1893. By 1893, the BSAC's financial position was severe. The Mashonaland gold rush had not materialized. The company's administrative account was running deficits. The police force cost £150,000 per year. Revenue from mining was negligible. Rhodes was funding operations through De Beers subsidies and personal contributions from himself and Bate. The company was not commercially viable on the terms its investors had been promised. Matabele land, the territory of the Ndebele Kingdom under Lobengula, immediately to the west of Mashonaland, was believed to contain better gold deposits. It also contained a kingdom that had not yet been conquered, land that had not yet been confiscated, and cattle herds that represented enormous economic value by the standards of the time. The company had the military force to take it. What it needed was a pretext. In July 1893, a Shona chief conducted a cattle raid on Ndebele territory and then sought refuge within the walls of the British Fort Victoria. An Ndebele raiding party followed, thousands of warriors entering what the BSAC considered its territory. Jameson, the company's chief administrator, immediately recognized the opportunity. He mobilized the company's forces without waiting for any formal authorization from the board in London. The British House of Commons would later see charges made accusing the company of having provoked the Ndebele specifically to secure their territory. The First Matabele War began in October 1893. Approximately 700 BSAC police and volunteers, supported by Maxim machine guns, firing at rates far beyond any conventional weapon of the era, advanced on Bulawayo. At the Battle of Bembasi on November 1, 1893, an estimated 2,500 Ndebele warriors were killed. The BSAC suffered fewer than 10 dead. The Maxim gun, used here for the first time in combat, proved literally decisive. Lobengula fled Bulawayo. Before the British column reached the Shangani River, he attempted to buy them off. 2 messengers carrying a box of gold sovereigns instructed to tell the British that the king admitted defeat and offered this tribute in return for a ceasefire. The messengers were allegedly robbed of the gold by the British soldiers who received them, and the column pressed on. Lobengula died in January 1894 under circumstances that remain disputed. Smallpox, possibly suicide, possibly something else. Bulawayo was taken. Matabele land was annexed. The BSAC now controlled all of what would become Southern Rhodesia. After the war, the company claimed the right to dispose of all land in Matabele land, arguing that Lobengula had owned it and forfeited it by going to war. The Colonial Office objected to the scope of this claim, but required only that sufficient land be reserved for the African population. Two reserves were set aside, the Shangani and Gwai, covering approximately 2.5 million acres. Before the European arrival, Africans had held nearly 100 million acres in what became southern Rhodesia. The Land Commission's allocation was described, even at the time, as inadequate and impractical. Its failure to make suitable provision for African lands was later cited as one of the prime causes of the 1896 uprisings. But in the immediate aftermath of the First Matabele War, the BSAC's share price rose. New shares were issued. The conquest of Matabeleland temporarily papered over the company's financial problems by demonstrating that it could expand its territorial base and, investors hoped, eventually access the mineral wealth that expansion implied. The gold of Matabeleland proved no more accessible than the gold of Mashonaland. Decision number 3, the Jameson Raid. When the board didn't know its own army was at war. The third decision is the one that Corporate Death Timelines normally reserves for the chapter titled, The CEO Goes Rogue. In the BSAC's case, it was simultaneously the CEO and his second-in-command, using the company's private military force to invade a sovereign foreign state, without authorization from most of their own board. By 1895, Rhodes had concluded that the company's financial salvation lay in the Transvaal. The Witwatersrand goldfields, which the BSAC and its railway ambitions had been designed to connect and eventually control, were being operated under a Boer government whose tax policies, labor regulations, and political structure Rhodes found both personally offensive and commercially harmful to his mining interests. The plan was coordinated over months. BSAC police would be positioned at Pitsan on the Transvaal border, ostensibly for railway construction purposes. A strip of Bechuanaland Protectorate was quietly ceded to the BSAC to give the staging area legal cover. Uitlander leaders in Johannesburg were cultivated, informed that a column from Rhodesia would arrive to support their uprising, and encouraged to prepare. The date was set. A pre-drafted letter, supposedly from Uitlander women and children in danger, was prepared to justify Jameson's intervention when it came. The Uitlander uprising did not materialize. The Johannesburg reformers delayed, disagreed, and ultimately had cold feet about the form of government they wanted after a successful coup. They sent messages asking Jameson to stand down. Jameson, with 600 men assembled, plans in motion, and his own judgment overriding his instructions, crossed the border into the Transvaal on December 29, 1895 anyway. "Unless I hear definitely to the contrary, shall leave tomorrow evening," he had telegraphed Rhodes. He sent the message late enough that by the time it arrived, he had already cut the telegraph wires. The column was intercepted. Boer commandos surrounded Jameson's force within 4 days. He surrendered on January 2, 1896. The entire operation had accomplished nothing. The Uitlander uprising never came. The Transvaal government was not overthrown. The goldfields remained under Kruger's control. In London, the news reached the BSAC's board as a shock. Most directors genuinely did not know the raid was coming. This is not a defense. It is an indictment of a different kind. The company's administrative structure was so dominated by Rhodes and his inner circle that a private military operation using company resources, company police, and company territory could be planned and executed without the knowledge of the nominal governing board. A senior Liberal politician, Sir William Harcourt, put it precisely in his parliamentary speech of May 1896. The company had been run by one set of men who are capable and not honest, and another set of men who are honest but entirely incapable. Rhodes at first denied responsibility. Then, as evidence accumulated, he assumed full responsibility for the planning, while claiming he had authorized only a support operation, not an invasion. He offered to resign as managing director. The board initially deferred on his resignation. By June 1896, under pressure from Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, Rhodes and Alfred Bate were removed as directors. The parliamentary committee that investigated the Jameson raid limited its scope to exclude Rhodes's broader role in fomenting an Uitlander uprising. Historians have since documented evidence suggesting that Chamberlain and Rhodes made a mutual protection arrangement, each shielding the other from the full extent of disclosure. The colonial secretary, who had quietly facilitated the staging area, and had advanced knowledge of the operation, remained in office. A subordinate official, Graham Bauer, secretary to the High Commissioner, was made the scapegoat, found guilty of grave dereliction of duty, and forced to resign. The raid had failed. The scapegoat had been selected. The company survived. Barely. Decision number 4. The insider selling. What the directors did with the stock. The fourth decision is the one that, in modern terms, would end careers, generate criminal prosecutions, and define the company's legacy in a single newspaper headline. Between July 1895 and March 1896, a period that encompasses the months before the Jameson raid, the raid itself, and its immediate aftermath, the BSAC's directors and senior associates reduced their collective shareholding from over 900,000 shares to fewer than 62,000 shares. Let that settle. The company's own leadership sold approximately 840,000 shares, nearly the entirety of their combined position, in the period immediately surrounding the event they had planned, executed, or had prior knowledge of. Henry Labouchere published the details in his January 1898 article, How Chartered Shares Were Sold Before the Raid. The sellers included the Dukes of Abercorn and Fife, the company's chairman and vice-chairman, both supposedly ignorant of the raid. Lord Gifford, Sir Horace Farquhar, Rhodes himself, Alfred Beit, members of the Rudd family, Lord Rothschild, Costin, and associated groups. Combined, 900,000 shares in July 1895. 61,457 shares by March 1896. The directors, when the raid failed and BSAC shares collapsed, had already largely exited their positions. The ordinary investors who had trusted the company's prospectus, the aristocratic board, the royal charter, and Rhodes's assurances of gold deposits, they held the stock as it fell. The insiders who had planned or known about the raid had sold into the pre-raid enthusiasm, when BSAC shares were still elevated on the expectation of the Transvaal gold that the raid was supposed to secure. In 21st century terms, this is insider trading on a scale that would be investigated by multiple regulatory agencies simultaneously. In 1896, it generated a sharp editorial in Labouchere's journal and some parliamentary discomfort. The same 3 directors who had been present when the shares were being sold remained on the BSAC's board after the investigation. This is what a corporate structure with royal patronage, aristocratic directors, and political protection looks like when it fails. The losses are socialized to ordinary investors. The accountability is limited to whoever cannot protect themselves. The institution survives because too many powerful people are implicated in its survival. Decision number 5. The 1896 uprisings when the company's model came due. The fifth decision, or more precisely the fifth consequence, is the one that revealed most clearly what the BSAC's territorial governance had actually created. In March 1896, the Ndebele rose in rebellion. In June, the Shona joined them. The simultaneous uprisings across virtually all of southern Rhodesia, involving most of the African communities in the territory, employing guerrilla tactics adapted from the disastrous lessons of the 1893 war, killed approximately 1 in every 10 European settlers in the country, and halted all European development for more than a year. The proximate causes were multiple and documented. British seizures of Ndebele cattle after the 1893 war, inadequate land allocation in the reserves, forced labor extraction, abusive company administrators, a devastating rinderpest epidemic that killed cattle herds, a locust plague that destroyed crops, drought. Each of these factors was a consequence of how the BSAC had administered its territories, extracting maximum value for the company's accounts, while providing minimal welfare investment for the population it was supposed to govern. The deeper cause was structural. The BSAC's charter was not designed to create a functional colony. It was designed to extract mineral wealth. When the mineral wealth proved insufficient to fund governance, the company extracted the shortfall from the African population through hut taxes, labor requirements, and land confiscation, creating conditions of systematic economic pressure on communities that had no political recourse within the company's governance structure. The BSAC's inability to suppress the uprisings on its own nearly forced its collapse. British government troops were deployed, at the company's expense, but the company's own police force was demonstrably insufficient to handle a territory-wide rebellion. Cecil Rhodes personally negotiated a peace agreement with Ndebele and Duna chiefs in the Matopos Hills, going into their territory essentially unarmed and talking directly with the men who had been waging war against his company. It was, by most accounts, his most genuinely impressive act, and it came in direct response to the consequences of his governance. The uprisings cost the company £750,000 in new debentures issued to finance the war costs, on top of the capital already consumed by the Jameson raid's fallout. Additional share issuances followed. By the end of 1896, the BSAC's issued share capital had reached £4.5 million, significantly above its original £1 million capitalization, reflecting the continuous need to raise additional funds to cover the deficit between what the company promised and what it could actually generate. The rebellions failed militarily, but they had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the BSAC's governance model was not producing a viable colony. It was producing a regime of extraction that generated resistance, requiring military suppression, which cost more than the extraction earned. Here is the contrarian lesson of the BSAC's corporate death timeline. The conventional explanation for the company's failure is Cecil Rhodes, his overreach, his recklessness, his hubris. And Rhodes was certainly a contributing factor. The man who planned the Jameson raid, who built his corporate structure to answer to himself rather than his board, who acquired territories on the basis of gold that wasn't there. Those are real failures of judgment and leadership. But the corporate structure enabled those failures. It was designed to enable them. The BSAC had a board of aristocrats chosen for social connections rather than business judgment. It had a charter that gave sovereign powers to a private entity without creating the accountability mechanisms that normally constrain sovereign power. It had access to a royal seal that gave ordinary investors confidence they had no rational basis for. It had political protection at the colonial office that allowed its most serious failures, the Rudd concession misrepresentation, the planned Jameson raid, the director share selling, to pass without full accountability. And it had a promised asset, the gold of Mashonaland, that didn't exist in the quantities claimed. This combination, structural accountability failure, promised asset that doesn't materialize, board capture by insiders, political protection of key decision-makers, ordinary investor losses. This is not a Victorian story. It is a template. It appears in the South Sea Bubble, in Enron, in various resource extraction companies whose promoters claimed reserves far beyond what geological reality would support. The specific lesson from the BSAC is this: a company with sovereign powers but no competitive accountability, governed by a board chosen for prestige rather than judgment, operating on a promise that its own management knew was overstated, will extract maximum value from its resource base, including from the people who live on that resource base, until the extraction generates resistance that exceeds the company's capacity to suppress. That is what happened in Rhodesia in 1896. The company ran out of capacity to suppress what its governance had created. It survived anyway, because of political protection. But it never paid a dividend. Now here is the thread connecting all three videos in today's arc. The Cape to Cairo Railway failed because the gold it was built to extract was not there. The BSAC failed because the gold it was chartered to mine was not there in the quantities promised. And every escalation from that point was an attempt to compensate for a broken financial premise through territorial expansion, private warfare, and the extraction of value from people rather than from the ground. Tomorrow's arc moves north, out of Africa, into the Soviet Union. We are going to look at what happens when a state, not a company, but an entire superpower, commits its full resources to an irrigation project designed to make cotton grow in a desert. When the same logic that animated the BSAC's extraction model, maximize short-term resource output, externalize all long-term costs, is applied at continental scale by a government with no shareholders to answer to and no colonial office to even pretend to provide oversight. The Aral Sea and the decision that drained it. That's next.